casino.
Has it been day?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're almost at 2 o'clock. Do we have Mr. Brownlee? Hi there. Welcome. If you're ready, we're happy to hear you.
Do you want to sit here?
Yes, you can sit there. We've read your submission, but happy for you to make a summary, or you may have a presentation of something for us.
I was just going to go into a little bit more detail on the submission, not a lot, but yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to speak. Submission. In conjunction with Horde NZ, I put this submission in, and I just want to go over what my block is, and it actually says it in here as well, and just a couple of other points to make as well. It's just our horticultural operations in Bayview, which is in the Hariri zone, and we're on the main road, 820 and 541, and also run a lease block, and this comprises of stone fruit, which is cherries, apricots, nectarines, peaches and plums, and then we also grow some apples and pears. And then when the land's not in orchard, we'll crop sweet corn and pumpkins. So just to give you a bit of a background on that. And it's generally we don't keep it in bare land, we want to develop it into orchard. So, and we've been in the growing business for 3 generations, my family has, and I personally have been growing orcharding and crops for 42 years and want to continue for another 30 years. So, you know, I mean, I propose to be in this game for as long as I can, as long as my health will allow that, and then pass the business on that is sustainable in the future as well. Yeah. We supply the New Zealand market mainly, as well as some export, but over time I think export's really important because the New Zealand market's only really small, so that will be the future for us. We employ, it said we originally had 3 permanent staff, but we have 2 permanent staff now, and then we employ 30 seasonal staff as well, and where we're at, we think the plan change 9 may affect our business, and that we may not be able to get enough water for our irrigation to grow the crops, and we need this water available to be from a model that is consistent with the needs of the crop we're growing. So, and it's not modelled on our past water use. So I'll just make that quite clear. If we conserve our water as much as we can, and we don't want to be penalised for lack of use of water down the track when we actually need the water, and we really need it. Therefore, the water allocation should be modelled for the crop grown. So we, at this present point in time, we're developing our orchards. We're pulling some old trees out and putting them into 2D systems, which is intensifying our land a lot more. So the water requirement may become greater because we do think that we'll probably double our production off the same area. And why we're doing this is to become sustainable into the future. The old systems are not sustainable with our new labour, cost of labour, and the whole inflationary thing that we're going to be going through in the short term. And then, as growers, we're audited through the New Zealand GAP and Global GAP system, And this satisfies our customers for our food, so to show that our food is safe, and all links in the chain are monitored and audited. We also have add-ons like GRASP, which is a requirement for supermarkets to check out our social practices. So in that thinking, farm plans should be an add-on to the New Zealand GAP and Global GAP system, therefore being more efficient and being under a national audited system. And just to wrap up, this is horticulture. Horticulture is very important to New Zealand. It feeds our people and other nations' people their nutrient requirements, and also creates employment, which contributes sustainably to our economy. We encourage a practical approach to the proposed plan change to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council's Resource Plan Change 9 for the Tukituka, Ariri, Narraroa, Karamu catchments that is sustainable for all stakeholders, so good things grow here.
Thank you, Mr. Brownlee. See if we've got any questions.
Mr. Brownlee, your source of water, what is that? Where is that from?
Oh, it comes from bore water?
Bore water. And is it metered?
Yeah, yes it is.
And how long do you have records for? Metered records?
Since the last consenting process, which I think was about 5 years ago.
5 years.
And you see, we've been through some dry periods in, say, 2011, so I don't think we've got enough records going back to understand our proper use, our proper requirement.
Thank you.
So during that time, your greatest water use would have been last summer?
Yes.
And would that be much higher than the other seasons which you've had your bore monitored? Sorry, your bore metered, I should say.
Yeah, it is. So really, I suppose the last time it was really dry was 2011, and was 1983, which is going back quite a way. But we try not to use as much water as we try to be very efficient with our water usage. But what we're finding is now, normally going into a harvest season, 10 days before, particularly with stone fruit, is a big requirement for water. So really, it's when the variety's due to be picked, that's when the requirement for water is greatest. But we're finding now that we're having to water in the off-season to sustain the trees going into the next year. So, like, we mainly harvest between November and January, which is, generally we get enough water, but now we're actually having to water in the January-February period to keep the trees sustainable for the following year.
I just had a couple of questions. You were saying about you're looking at currently pulling out some of the trees, intensifying the planting. Is this for apples, or is this across all the varieties of fruit?
Across all the varieties. We believe it's the way we all stay in business. With the big old trees now, you can't efficiently get people to prune them or pick them. Where now 2D is going more into platform harvesting, and then the robotics won't be too far away from picking.
And so that responds to the labour shortages. And we had a presentation that gave us some quite good detail about particularly apples from Mr. Apple, talking about different types of varieties, smaller root ball, requiring a little bit of water but more often. And I just wondered whether that particular model is responding to labour, but in my mind it doesn't seem to respond to availability of water, because it requires more water.
Yeah, sorry, I probably didn't explain that well enough, is that we're putting a lot more trees in per hectare,
Yes.
and we're moving the row spacings right up. So we're getting, there's a lot more volume of trees in the ground, so we should double our production of that, so our photosynthetic area becomes a lot greater. And so you have more utilisation of resources at that point.
Hence a higher requirement for water.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think that's terribly important going forward for the sustainability of our businesses.
Thank you. We didn't have any other questions. Thanks for coming along.
No, thank you very much.
Mr. John Parsons. Sorry, Nicola, was that a nod or a?
No, that was
Okay. And did we have Brian McClay? It's not for 240.
Tom Kay's just walked in from Forest.
Oh, very
Who's this?
Mr. Parsons.
Oh, this is-
Submission 49. Afternoon, Mr. Parsons. Get yourself all set up. We're just going to bring up your submission on our. Here we go. Right. Welcome, Mr. Parsons. I'm happy for you to make your submission to us. We've read your submission. Happy for you to pick out any particular points you want to refer us to, and particularly as they relate to your orchards that you're looking after.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm an owner-operator down a small street, St Andrews Road in Havelock North, and I've been there for over 30 years. I've got a block I own down there of 2 hectares, and then lease another 5 blocks of approximately the same size. So I've amalgamated and run it as a 1 unit, and you'd call them lifestyle blocks. And I've redeveloped and planted them all in modern apple trees as the time arises, or as the variety ceases to be marketable. I guess one of the things over all the years is that I've appreciated the ability in the regional council to go in and discuss and work out how to make things work, because nothing's ever necessarily straightforward, and there are a lot of individual circumstances, and that's certainly apparent in latter years down St Andrews Road, where lifestylers own the property now, and so I've got to be pretty cognizant of them having lifestyle enjoyment while running an orchard and spraying, and well, this is irrigation, but spraying is a good example of the noise and the spray and things. So you've got and then like these consents are generally held by the landowners, and they know nothing about the water. They aren't really interested. So I've got to do all that work for them, and so again, with the regional council, it's been helpful just to ring them up and chat and figure out how to manage the situation. And latterly, it's been operating, putting the irrigation systems into running under 4.5 litres per second, and therefore minimising the compliance costs in regards to meters and that sort of thing, which is, and I've worked around that. So, yeah, it just so that you could, working within the framework and the requirements, but that not having a strict system where you have to do a lot of compliance to achieve the same result. Maybe it's in the view of having a global consent, a mini global consent type thing. And certainly that seems to be an overarching thing. I'm next to the Karamu stream, so aware that that's probably, the Karamu has a lot of, lower flows, and so I'm very much aware that people are wanting to look after the stream, but that's not an easy thing as well. As I've watched plantings that have been done, washed away in the flood, or not looked after, and they just die. So it's not an easy fix. Another example is that I irrigate, or let me phrase another way, that there's some discussion that if you don't use your irrigation consent or allowance and you're not proving that you're using it, then you'll lose it. Now I've got a situation where I irrigate one of the landlord's properties off another, because that's the economical way to do it with one pump and one system, but the council have allowed me to put a pipe underneath, the irrigation pipe underneath the road, and that's the best way to irrigate. If I'm to give up that lease, then does that landowner lose the ability to irrigate their orchard? And if they lose that ability because they haven't used their own water, then they've got to rip the orchard out, which is not a healthy thing. Because there's a lot of pressure for the land use change down St Andrews Road to change into residential or non-productive, non-food producing area, should I say. So that's another example of where with the regional council I've had worked out it works well. The augmentation of the water for the Karamu stream, I reckon that's a really interesting thing, and be quite happy to see, that makes sense to do something along those lines to keep the flow going, and then we've got, we know that we've got a availability of water when we need it, when it's crucial to the crop in any given year. So that augmentation and how you go about it, it's not I'm not sure, but a deep well or dams or whatever, but that seems a sensible outcome. The use of Irrical, I've found that useful, and with the systems I've got, I'm not using the full Irrical allowance. On one of the blocks, I do, the other 5 I don't, and that's just sort of more modern irrigation drip line that I've put in. The replacement of trees. So again, with one block, I've got old trees with deep roots, and I don't really have to irrigate them at all because they're old, big, established trees. The new methods of planting are dwarfing rootstock, shallower rooting, and they need the water to produce because you're after higher quality fruit. So if I'm not using much water on that block and come to redevelop it, and I haven't been using the allocation I've been given, again, I'm confined about how to use that ground for a new variety of apples, which you couldn't, I couldn't do without irrigation nowadays. So I'd need to increase the water I use. But it's well within the consented amount. There's no argument there. I think the real thing is that the smaller blocks around the Heretaunga Plains are under a lot of pressure to be able to keep the food production going on those smaller blocks. And this water, availability of water is just another thing that's going to see the demise of them. And I'd like to see the ability to be able to access water and use water to continue. I've been a member of the Fruit Growers Association all my time and served on the committee, and it's just been such a big thing for us to preserve the productive land on the Heretaunga Plains. And then just in closing, really like to see a workable outcome. Things do have to change, accept that, but to be workable, because you still have to work the land and you still have to get things. You still need water to produce your product, your fruit. So that's how I'd like to just finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. We'll see if we've got any questions.
Sorry, in total, how many, sorry, excuse me, mate. So in total, how many bores have you got on the various properties that you have, Mr. Parsons?
One per property, one per lease.
So
block.
there's what, half a dozen of them?
Six, yep.
Six.
Yep.
And most of them are under the 5 litres a second or 100 cubes a day, are they?
Approximately half are, but there's all but one are set up for greater than 4.5. So whilst I have a permit to use more, I don't, than 4.5. Because they were 20-year consents, they were running on an old water allocation.
What's the irrigation method for them? I know it's. It was. You said are they all apples? Is it apples across all of them?
All apples.
Now, how are they irrigated at present?
Well,
you mentioned the old stock.
When I went there, it was with 3-inch pipes.
Okay.
And then converted to mini sprinklers.
Okay.
And so one block's mini sprinklers, and all the rest are now drip line.
Do you have any questions? Thank you, Mr. Parsons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Brian McLean, submitted an attorney. We've raced ahead of our schedule. Sorry about that. We have down here Tom Kay from Forest and Birds. Okay, then we're going to have Tom Kay's here. He is. Is Mr. Kay here? No, I'm getting over to his mic. Okay. Oh, we've got about 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes before our next submitter. Your schedule, which is an unusual thing. So happy to hear you when you're ready. Don't think you need to rush on our part.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you for hearing me today. I guess I'd like to just start out by making quite clear that the views I present today are my own personal views, not the views of my employer. So I just make that.
I'm sorry, who's your employer?
I work part-time at EIT.
Oh, okay.
In many spaces. I have a history in valuing and consultancy, farming, orcharding, cropping. I'm a long-time Twyford resident and a director in Twyford Cooperative Company. And as you've already heard, I teach in the education. I'm in the education space. I guess for me, and I looked at a number of the issues, and I guess a lot of the technical stuff you'll be dealing with through a whole lot of expert witnesses. But for me, I guess I just wanted to raise a few issues around water quality, and for me, what we're talking about is more about water quality and creating a sustainable environment for our aquatic life, and not just about volumes. Which is what this debate, or certainly a lot of this debate, seems to be about, how much water and where it goes. There are a number of, I guess, environmental issues around sustainability, and these include things like purity, temperature, and areas such as dissolved oxygen. Our aquatic life don't get concerned whether our waterways are flowing at 250 litres a second or 350 litres a second. Their concern is the environment there that they can live in and that they can breed in. Many of our aquatic life species that we deal with in our rivers and waterways currently quite easily survive in our many lakes, such as Lake Taupo. So the true measure of our water system's health is not just about flow rates. As I say, there's all these other measures. So I guess I'm keen for any decisions that are made by the panel to leave our current low flow levels in place and encourage all of us as parties to this to continue to sit around the table and create innovative outcomes, not roadblocks to improving the collective benefit of our region. So I'm really keen, and a lot of what I do is about working together for collective and collaborative solutions. I find this whole environment where we sit down and actually, I guess, at opposing views, challenging. It's not certainly how I like to do things. I like to certainly see collaboration, and I guess I like to see us also use a whole lot of innovative solutions. Now, there are a number out there, and I guess I can case the example of the augmentation site in Twyford, which happens to sit on family land, which was under my care when it was introduced, and I've been a significant part in the introduction of that augmentation site. Any decision, I guess, imposed on global restrictions on water should, in my view, be careful not to create a huge economic carnage to our area or our region, which is unrecoverable. If we are to remain sustainable as a region and prosperous, we need reliable water. We as an industry or a region have seen unprecedented growth in our region through horticultural industries, and a lot of that has been based around the reliable water. And any decision that may be made to take away that reliability, I see as having a significant negative impact. We as farmers and horticulturalists are exceedingly resilient. We have to be. We're at nature's whim every day. It rains, we get frost, we get hail, we get drought. But we equally as investors make decisions around risk mitigation. We can spray our trees and we can tile drain. We can put in wind machines and we can insure our crops. We can select crops that are based around the soil type, and we can and have chosen to invest based on reliable water. This region is envied throughout the world because of its fertile soils, its temperate climate and its secure water. Please don't take away or reduce our water. We as industries have invested millions in our businesses based on these factors. Removal of these key ingredients will tip the balance. We as growers invest amounts of up to in excess of $1,700 per hectare per year to grow our crops. And we do this on the basis we will get that money back and hopefully a profit over and above that. In most years, our water is needed as an essential way of helping us achieve this return. And in some years, the water that we are allocated and is available is unlikely to be enough currently to severely reduce any income balance. I asked the panel, would you personally invest, like many of us in the industry, in excess of $1 million in a year in a business, unless you had a high chance of getting that money back, plus some potential profit? It is like you going to work every day of the year, hoping your employer will pay you at the end of the year. The model has been long since made. We don't now want to and cannot afford to play the game with a new set of dice and a new set of odds. Without our business, there will not be the jobs. In my small business, when I had it, I employed 6 permanent staff and up to 50 casual staff. Businesses like mine are now few and far between under this current model. Our industry is not easy. In addition to all of the growing concerns, we're influenced by not only local but world supply and demand issues, exchange rates, interest rates, wage rates, and availability of staff. In some crops like apples, we don't receive full income or returns till nearly 18 months after we started meeting the expenses on that crop. Some would have you believe we all make excessive profits. In some years, profits are great, but this is not always the case. In some years, they can be devastating losses. We as growers are optimistic, believing that next year will be better or better than the last. We can only pick ourselves up after those devastating years when we know that the key elements are covered: soil, water and sun. We as a region have seen firsthand the impact of closures of one business, Wakatu, in 1986, which saw 1,500 jobs lost. The decisions you make here today or in this process could have 10 times the impact on our region if water is not guaranteed. Water is the lifeblood of our region. It may return. So I'm a passionate member of our community and I wish to see it continue to be prosperous and economic. If placing restrictions are to be made, then I believe they should be evenly distributed amongst all benefactors, not just the primary industry. And I guess I see for here that, and ask you to please leave our region in a healthy state, keep it away from economic ruin, and don't provide a legacy where this process will be remembered adversely for generations to come. Thank you.
You made a comment earlier at the start of your presentation about sustainable aquatic life, and you made a reference to Lake Taupo, which I didn't quite get, and I'm wondering if you can explain that.
There's quite reasonable aquatic life on Lake Taupo. There is no 100 litres per second flowing in and out and past the fish life in Lake Taupo at any one point. So my point was really, when we look at flows, it's actually about the temperature, it's about the water quality, and it's about things like depth and whatever. Now that's not necessarily reflective of the flow of the water past a point at any time. No. So our lakes don't have flowing water at 1,500 litres per second, or like in the Narrow River, or 300 litres per second, like in the Raupery.
Just on that same point, in week one of these hearings, we were at Ngangaro Marae, and we were shown images and video footage of the local streams that had dried up, and we saw fish that were dead in those streams, including eels. So I wasn't quite sure what the Lake Taupō analogy meant, because we've seen examples locally here in the Hawke's Bay where fish are dead in the former bed of streams. So it seemed to me that that's a practical example of water quantity being actually a really important issue.
I don't disagree with that, although I guess it's more about limits, and or if those streams and waterways had areas where the fish could move to and survive, they may not have died. I see the augmentation as another way of actually ensuring that there is sufficient water, but I don't necessarily see a measuring stick where we have to have a certain amount of litres go past a point at all day, every day, throughout the whole of a given year or a period in the summer. We need to create an environment within the water system which will enable that aquatic life to survive. And I totally agree with you that zero or even a very, very minimal level is not acceptable, but there are ways that we can modify our systems to ensure that there is sufficient water for that aquatic life to survive.
Have I got it right that you're suggesting, these are my words, a demand-led approach where users use as much water they need to be economically viable, not environmentally sustainable, economically viable, and then also you find a place which could sustain fish life somewhere else? That's what I'm hearing. I just want to be clear that
I think it'd be fair to say that I guess what I'm saying is, and I believe there's a balance between the economics and the environment, yes. And so yes, in respect to that, there is a ground somewhere that I don't think we should turn the tap off on the economic sector. Equally, I don't believe we should be taking negative steps. So I'm not proposing that more water goes at all. In fact, I think as I say, there is some middle ground, but there are things that we can do to enhance our whole system. That can be things like, in events like we've got at the moment, using the aquifer recharge system to use surplus water to make sure our aquifer is fully recharged. It could be placing in weirs or small water structures that actually create an increased depth of water in a water system to enable that aquatic life to survive while still having a flow going past it, not necessarily the flow that is defined in the mandates that are proposed. Okay. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't want to see decisions that are made that don't allow an opportunity for creativity and innovativeness to actually allow us to get and maintain and preserve our environment. I don't want to turn. I believe that the agriculture and horticulture sector have to be mindful of the water they use. There's no doubt about that, but equally when business decisions have already been made, it's really, really hard to turn the clock back and change that and not have a huge significant impact on this region.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, because I was, that makes sense to me in my mind, because earlier what you were describing to me is a crisis management approach where you would go until something happens, there's no water.
No.
Collapse, the industry collapses, and then you start again. So
far from it. I mean, I'm quite supportive of a very strong environmental approach, and I guess my view is really that we need to just step back and say, what other avenues can we take? And I've just put two off to the side views. I feel that a lot of time and energy of some really, really clever people is being used and utilised in fighting or debating the process rather than actually in going towards creating innovative solutions. And so I value the collaborative team approach, kicking the tyres, looking at what's going on, looking at whether there are things, as I say, the augmentation in its first instance was a challenge to everyone. It's shown that a lot can be done. My question is whether we need to have the Raupery stream, for argument's sake, operate at 300 litres per second all day, every day, or can we operate it at 200 litres a second for 12 or 14 hours of the day and ensure that it's brought up to the full 300 litres a second. The aquatic life is still maintained, the water system is still maintained, and we've preserved its drainage requirements, all of the things that need to be. So it's a matter of wearing all the hats, getting in the room and collectively finding solutions, rather than an approach where we sit there and say, we've sat down and talked about it, yes, that's fine, but now we would like to potentially consider that that's not good enough and we want to just sit out here until you move to that point. So I'm not being critical of the people who are making the decisions. They're doing just what I'm doing and acting in the best interest of the people around. I'm also trying to wear a hat of acting in the best interest of the people that I used to employ, the people who live in Flaxmere, but equally the people who I work with that have huge businesses and tens of millions of dollars invested, that without some form of surety of carrying on, won't continue to invest and or may not survive. And so it's this whole balance of economic and environment, and we are moving at a huge pace. And this is probably one of the challenges. We're moving from a situation where we're exceedingly, I guess there's this perception that the rural community has been very, very poor on our environment. And there's an element of definite truth in that. But if I walk the water systems in our part of the area, the urban dwellers have had as much of an effect on polluting our waterways, more of an effect actually of polluting our waterways than our farming and orcharding people. So it's everyone has a part to play. We have to collectively all change our views, wear a hat that says, hey, what can we do? Not what can everyone else do. What can we do? What can I do to actually make this a better environment?
I think you've answered my question, but sorry, right, I actually cut in across you, so I'm going to pass it back to you.
No, you've done it. You've said it all. Thank you.
No.
That's all our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Mr. Tom Kay from Forest and Bird. Welcome. Yes. We've got I just want to be clear, we've just got a little bit of an issue. So we've got your summary here. We've previously received your evidence, and we've got submissions from legal counsel. But I don't think we've seen these before. Were you just wanting to just provide these to us, or because we haven't had a read of these?
Yeah, no. So, well, my understanding was the legal submission is to be presented. So legal counsel is joining me. I think whoever's on the Zoom link. And my understanding was we were requested in the minute to bring a summary of our evidence. Therefore, that is what that 3-page summary is.
That's okay. We had requested in our previous minutes that legal submissions provided to us 24 hours beforehand, just so we could read them before so we're just prepared with any questions that we might have. So we've just received these.
That is fine. I'll have to apologise on behalf of legal counsel.
That's okay. These situations happen, so we're all about solution focus. I'm just wondering, because we're just a little bit ahead of time, we're supposed to be at 3 o'clock, and I'm just wondering if you just give us 10 minutes, we'll have a read of this, and then we'll be all ready to go as we've scheduled.
Yep.
How's that sound?
That sounds good.
That's great. Thank you.
Cool.
So we'll have a quick read.
This relates to CHS go. We have discretion to set our own time frames. So this is the applicant must respond and stuff that was in our minute. But this is 41B relates to consent hearings, not plan hearings. We can set our own framework to we actually asked the comments on those by, what's the date?
So I guess I'll just, hopefully Peter can hear us there, but I'll just introduce myself. I'm Tom Kay. I work for Forest and Bird. I've obviously provided some expert evidence and there's a summary of that which you have in front of you. I have the slightly awkward position that I've provided expert evidence, but my name is also to the submission. Obviously that's me as the contact person for the submission, being in that role for this region. And then we've got our legal sub from Legal Counsel Peter Anderson, who can hopefully hear us and is on the screen there. Can you hear us, Peter?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
Let's do a test. Test 1, 2. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. That's good. Fantastic.
So maybe I'll defer to Peter, but Peter, just for context, we've just had hopefully the legal sub read through and potentially the summary of evidence. Whether it's worth requesting Peter go through some of those points or whether you just want to ask questions in the first instance, I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, so what we've done with submitters, if they had legal submissions, asked for them 24 hours beforehand, just so we could have a read of it, and then asked legal counsel for each of the parties to give us a summary or particularly point out the points that they think are particularly important they want us to note. Obviously, you want to note all of the things that you've prepared, of course, but certainly those things you want to highlight for us, we're happy to do that, and then we'll hear from experts and then ask questions. So that's how we're normally going. So we've had a chance to have a read of the legal submissions. So I'll leave it in your hands in terms of how you wanted to present this part.
Sure. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you nice and loud.
Great. So apologies for the not providing the legal submissions in advance. You probably understand we had the water conservation order hearing last week, which took out most of the week. So that the weekend's work was getting the submissions done. So that's that just is what it is. So I apologise for that. But here we are. So what I think I'll do is I'll just work through the key points. We haven't got time to go through and blow by blow. So in relation to matters that I don't speak to now, I rely on the legal submission that's put up and the original submission and to set out for us in best position. The first point I want to make is around the decision about excluding the expert evidence from Ngāti Kahungunu. I think that decision was wrong. And I've set out the reasons for that in the legal submission. The requirement to provide submissions 10 days in advance of the hearing didn't comply with Section 41B, and the evidence was provided more than 5 working days before the hearing, which is what Section 41B requires. So to classify that evidence as late is incorrect. It might have been late pursuant to your directions, but in terms of what the law requires, that expert evidence was not late. On that basis, there's no ground to it. Even if it was late, simply saying evidence is late, therefore it is inadmissible, isn't the correct approach under the Evidence Act to deal with evidence. There's a presumption that evidence is admissible, and if it's relevant, so a blanket decision to exclude relevant evidence based on failing to meet a timetable is not the correct approach to
Could I get your view on that? And I'd appreciate it. We'd clearly set out the timetable for when we expected evidence to be presented, and we were told by a number of parties that they required extra time, and so we gave an extension, and we indicated we were happy to do an extension, but we weren't going to receive any late evidence after that date, and then we've received late evidence after that date. That time wasn't allocated to anybody else to present evidence 5 working days before the hearing, and I acknowledge that in terms of that time frame, but that's what we'd set out very clearly in our minute in terms of the procedures that we were going to follow. So I just wanted your view in regards to that. So we've been clear about what our time expectations for the receipt of evidence, but that doesn't apply to everybody.
I'm not sure when you're finishing. There's a bit of a lag on the slide.
Sorry, there's a bit of lag there. Sorry, I appreciate that.
Yes, no, please, I wasn't intending to be rude or interrupt you, but in order to answer that question, I understand you clearly set out those timetables.
Yes.
The requirement in the Act is 5 working days, so you can't direct evidence be presented more than 5 working days before the hearing, because that's what Section 41B. And if you did, and someone provides it within the 5 working days, then they've complied with the legal requirement in terms of direction you give. I understand the point you're making, but the second point I'd make is that simply by virtue of being late, does not make evidence inadmissible. And that you need to make an assessment as to how to deal with any prejudice that arises from it.
Yes,
But a simple decision that evidence that is late is inadmissible is not a correct legal approach.
But 41B relates to consent hearings, doesn't it? It talks about the applicant and submitters, and we can determine our own procedures. That's always been the case. Those are simply minimum standards.
Yes, and those minimum standards have been complied with.
Yeah, and that's your point you're making. Okay.
That's my point.
Okay.
I just think as a matter, I mean, particularly the nature of the evidence being cultural evidence, I think that it is really unfortunate to exclude that evidence. Because the ruling you've made is a ruling of admissibility, which is a particular legal ruling, and it wasn't a matter of weight or anything like that. You made a ruling that evidence could not be heard, and that is a problem in terms of what the requirements in relation to considering evidence are.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those comments. We'll probably take some further advice on that. But if you'd like to carry on, that'd be great.
Sure. So the next issue I'd like to address is the question of the scope of the ability to make changes, particularly in relation to the requirement to give effect to the NPSFM.
Yes.
And so my submission is that the obligation on the panel is to give effect to the NPSFM 2020 as far as possible within the scope of submissions.
Yes.
So the situation is that the 2017 NPSFM no longer exists. So there can be no ability to give effect to the 2017 NPSFM because it's not a legal document anymore. The requirement is to give effect to the NPSFM 2020, and that is bound by the obligations of scope. So obviously, if there are questions of scope and whether the changes are within or without of scope, that is a different legal inquiry that needs to be made. But in relation to that, the question of what the obligation on the panel is, give effect to the NPSFM 2020 as far as possible from the scope of submissions. There are a number of broad submissions that if there's any doubt about whether relief sought is within scope, then I think the circumstances of this demand are kind of a relatively permissive approach to dealing with scope, given the broad nature of submissions. The scenario, which is the NPSFM coming in mid.
I'm just interested in your view in regards to the scope issue, because this is something we've asked each of the legal counsel in terms of their views on it, and I don't think you could say we've had a range of views, diverse views. They've all been quite similar, but with different nuances. But probably the one that I'm most interested in getting your view on was we had legal counsel from Low Corporation who took a very, I'll call it a pedantic view, in that the scope of the submissions in regards to implementation of the National Policy Statement 2020 had to be quite specific in the submissions, like the specific relief sought, rather than a general term like implement the NPSFM 2020. It had to be quite specific to the policies and quite specific about the relief sought. So I just wanted to see what your view is on it. I think I've got your view from your submissions, but just if you can articulate that further.
I think that the absence of a particular reference to particular words, but you approach this in the way you normally address the question of scope. What does the submission say? What's reasonably and fairly within the scope of that submission? And then what, if you adopt that line, as your cross-check, is anyone likely to be negatively affected by not having the opportunity to comment on that particular matter? So I think if you adopt that approach, then the fact that this is a big hearing, there are lots of submitters, but the question of unfairly prejudicing particular parties in relation to this, everyone will have had the opportunity to come along and express their views on the NPSFM 2020. So questions of prejudice, I don't think particularly arise in relation to this. So just approaching the scope of submissions in the normal way. If there's a submission that seeks the giving effect to the MPSFM 2020, and we've got a rough idea what that might be in terms of ecosystem health, Te Mana Otuai, and those kind of things. And I don't think there's any issue with implementing that in the way that you would. And it doesn't have to have been specifically set out in the original submission.
Hey, thank you for that.
I guess I'm nervous about running Tom out of time. So I do just bear with me for a moment. I'm reasonably happy to have most of the balance of the submissions taken as read.
Oh, sorry, I was probably being selfish. Those were the two important questions that were in my mind. I wasn't thinking about my other panel members, but in terms of your submissions, I'm sorted now.
To be fair, those were the issues that were in my mind as being important issues, from a legal perspective to deal with as well. So I think I do just want to briefly address the Te Mana Otuai and the obligation that imposes as a consequence of the 2020 MPSFM, and the kind of reshaping of what Te Mana Otuai is with respect to the ecological health as the most important thing, and so I guess bearing that in mind, that when we go about dealing with this plan, then we need to implement Te Mana Otuai. So we need to look after the ecological health of the water bodies first, then the people, and then the economics. And I think that is the way that we have to do it at the moment now, as a consequence of the MPSFM. And there are some parts of TANK which don't do that properly. And I think I've referenced one of the objectives, which talks about upholding and recognising Te Mana Otuai. Now, that's not the language that we have to use now in relation to Te Mana Otuai with respect to the MPSFM. It's a higher level obligation than that. That's kind of the key point I want to make about that. And I noticed that I've taken up 15 of our 20 minutes. So unless there's any other particular issues that the panel wants to raise, I'm happy to pass over to Tom. Sure.
Yeah, we've just got one more question for you, and then we'll move to Mr. Kane.
So have you got a copy of the National Policy Statement handy? Have you got a copy of the MPS 2020 handy?
I can just get it now.
So what I will ask is, in terms of subpart 1 and sections 3.2 and 3.4, it says every regional council must engage with communities and tangata whenua to determine how Te Mana Whai applies to water bodies and freshwater ecosystems in the region. And 3.4 says must actively involve tangata whenua in decision-making processes, including identifying the local approach. Now that talks about a region-wide approach, not a sub-region-wide approach. Do you have any comment on those matters?
So what? Just I haven't managed to open the document, but I think I can answer that question without doing so. So I think what I agree totally that giving effect to the specific process in the MPSFM, which is about the process of making plans and consultation, and that cannot be done in the context of this plan change. So this plan change cannot fully implement the MPSFM because there are process aspects of the MPSFM which, as a consequence of timing, cannot. They're just not met as a consequence of timing. So, so yes, I agree with you insofar as that there are those things have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with in the context of the upcoming plan changes, which are there for 2020. What the kind of the flip side of that is that where there is a provision or in the plan which isn't dependent on that community process and can be implemented in accordance with the MPSFM 2020, that should be what happens.
And my other question relates to Objective Tank 16, which you've been critical about, and says it's got it round the wrong way. That's not the way I read it. It says ground and surface water, and I'm looking at the latest version in the addendum report. Ground and surface
So bear with
water
me a moment and I'll get that.
Well, let me read to you the starters. Ground and surface water in the tank catchment is allocated subject to limits, targets and flow regimes which provide for the values of each water body in the following priority order. So it says subject to limits, targets and flow regimes which provide for the values of each water body. Doesn't that give priority to, give priority to the first limb of the objective of the MPS?
That's not brilliantly drafted because the in the following priority order is slightly confused. But if you're saying that provide for the values of each water body is effectively the first limb of Te Mana o Te Wai, then I would agree with that. What I would say is that some more clarity as to what is meant by the values of each water body would be helpful. So a clear link into the ecological values or the Tier 1 Te Mana o Te Wai, and then a drafting attempt to make sure that that is clear would be helpful. But yes, to answer your question, if that is what the intention of that provision is, I agree with you. But I think there's some drafting improvements that could be made.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Kay.
I'm not sure if you had a chance to read through my summary of evidence or not.
No, we just did the legal ones.
Yep, that's all right. Is it worth me going through that very quickly and then just taking any questions that you have?
Yes, because we've read your evidence and I'm sure we've got some questions for you.
So, I mean, essentially, Forest and Bird submission requests, I guess, a greater focus on some protections for habitat quality and natural character, given their status in the NPS. And my evidence introduces a potential way of capturing that and some protections for that through the use of the natural character index or the habitat quality index, which in essence is basically just taking a water body in its current state and measuring in future any changes to that water body. So, for instance, looking at the equivalent of Google aerial imagery from 2015, comparing it to imagery now, and looking at things like the active channel width, the braiding index, that kind of stuff, and making a ratio score basically in the difference in those characteristics. So essentially, you get the river might have narrowed by a certain number of metres, and that might represent a 10% change in the value of that variable, and therefore, say a 10% reduction or a 10% increase or whatever. I will allow you to just read through the summary of evidence in your own time, but I do provide an evidence a picture on the front page that shows kind of what high natural character and high habitat quality looks like in a reach of the Narurora, and what low natural character and low habitat quality kind of looks like channelized river. Very little in the way of habitat provision and diversity. The way I propose capturing this in the tank plan change is to introduce something essentially into the schedules accompanied by direction and the objectives, and I can't speak exactly to the planning part of those, but essentially putting some limits and targets into the attribute tables for the water bodies that say, well, we will kind of monitor these things that are in Schedule 26, and we will insert a value in there that says actually if we will aim to keep the natural character index, therefore basically the channel width, the sinuosity, the braiding index, those kind of things are at or above the levels that they are at now, with some allowance for a bit of natural variability, which may change those variables slightly. So I basically had proposed a value of 0.85, so essentially allowing for sort of a 15% variation in the water bodies, which would capture hopefully natural variation, which is based on a suggestion from Professor Russell Death at Massey University, but also on some analysis that was done for the Narurora River in the Water Conservation Order case, which is quite a braided river responds a lot to change and floods and things like that. So that was deemed to be a reasonable level of change to capture. And by putting that into Schedule 26, you basically require that council monitor those things and keep track of any change in natural character and habitat quality over time. And that would occur kind of on a 5-yearly basis, as you would do for any of your other variables. You know, when you're measuring, say, MCI and looking at trends, you're doing it based on a 5-year trend. And then in more specific circumstances, you would have people applying for resource consents, say to build a culvert or a bridge or do some in-stream channel works, and you would essentially put on the conditions of that resource consent a requirement that they undertake an analysis, a habitat quality index analysis based on the species that are expected to be found in that reach, measuring things before they start their work, measuring things after their work, and showing that they have actually maintained the habitat quality in those reaches. And it's not a crazy suggestion or anything. There are a few documents which I refer to in my evidence, but basically guidelines saying, look, this is the steps you go through if you're going to do that assessment. This is what you'd need to do. This is how you would prove that. And council could just measure against those values in Schedule 26. So I realise we've probably used up all the time, so I'll leave that to you to read the summary, and you've obviously got my evidence, you've got our legal submission, and if there are any questions, we can take them. Otherwise, we can leave it there.
I've been holding up the time I had to go and guess it, but I'll better pass it on to you.
I've got just a few questions. Mr. Kay, can I just take you to your paragraph 57 of your evidence in chief?
Sorry, 57?
57?
You can. Give me a second. Yes.
So you start that paragraph saying, I consider the natural character habitat quality index can be incorporated into PC9 to help achieve policy requirements by, and then you go to Roman numeral 3, requiring significant activity with a potential impact on natural character or habitat quality to include blah, blah, blah. So can you give me some examples of what you consider to be significant activities?
So the most obvious that comes to mind is flood control and anything captured under a flood control scheme or management plan. So often they are provided for under the plan, or they might be consented individually, but things like gravel extraction, which could be as part of flood control or could be an activity in and of itself that's consented, things like willow planting.
So are those activities covered under PC9?
My understanding is, that's a good question. I probably would have to defer to a planner on that.
I'm not sure they are.
They're Section 13 RMA consents. The Plan Change 9 is dealing with Section 14 and 15 RMA consents. It's not dealing with activities in the beds of rivers, which is Section 13.
Okay, I can.
So I was struggling with your evidence to see the relevance of. I'm not going to get into the merits of the NCI or the Habitat Quality Index, but I just questioning its relevance and applying it to say Schedule 26 of Plan Change 9. When I couldn't see any link back to particular rules and policies that PC9 deals with specifically.
Yeah, I guess that's a question for someone else to answer in terms of where it fits into the planning framework. In terms of the ecological integrity of the tank water bodies, habitat and natural character is key to all those things. So water quality and water quantity and quality are generally focused on. The physical habitat itself and the condition of the river and the bed is not often focused on. The Wellington Natural Resources Plan had originally some proposals around physical habitat and things like that in similar sorts of tables to the tank tables. It was captured as a component of ecosystem health under the NPS. Therefore, kind of that's the basis that it's presented on. But in terms of those questions specifically that you've got there, I'm probably not the one to speak to those.
Just a couple of minor ones. Paragraph 58. you refer to 62 Roman, Roman numeral 2, and in 64 you refer to 62
Yes,
Roman numeral 3. Can you just,
apologies. They should be, they should be referring to the previous paragraph
57?
above. Yes, 57.
And just one question. Paragraph 45 and elsewhere, but so you refer to a number of papers there by Death and others. I don't know what the NDA, NDB.
They are
See,
the dates, so no date referenced in my references at the end of the document. That's just so you know which of the reports you should be looking
So are they scientifically peer-reviewed papers?
at. Not all of those are published, no, and there's explicit acknowledgement of that in the references to my evidence. The one that is published is the 2021 paper, which is also in my references, starting with Fuller. So that's a recent publication, 2020 publication around the Natural Character Index and its use in New Zealand and overseas.
Thank you. So I'm not sure whether you said it explicitly in your evidence, but has any of those two indices been used in other regional plans that you're aware of?
That I'm aware of, no, they haven't been used in plans. They have been proposed, well, I shouldn't say proposed, they were requested for use in the Wellington Natural Resources Plan. They haven't come through. I don't say that in that they were dismissed as being, they weren't dismissed as being, my understanding is they were dismissed based on the fact that they weren't considered what was referred to as integrated indicators of ecosystem health, because they were about the physical condition of the river. Now, I think that's an issue that's up for dispute. The Wellington Plan was trying to focus on things like macroinvertebrates, fish, and water quality. The NPS shows that actually we need to focus our ecosystem health on 5 key biophysical components, which includes physical habitat. So they didn't make it through into the Wellington Plan, but they were requested there. They are being used in river management, so in the Horizons region, in the Greater Wellington region. They haven't yet made their way into a plan.
So council are using them as monitoring tools?
For river management, yes, and to inform their flood protection works and things like that. Particularly when you consider that rivers like so in the Horizons region, the Rangitike, which is sort of semi-braided character, not dissimilar to the Naruroro, has a water conservation order on it. There's been significant constriction of those braided reaches of that river, so there's a desire from the council to figure out what the impact of their activity on that river has been and how to get it kind of back. And with the Wellington rivers like the Hutt, the Otaki, that have kind of wandering within gravel beds that have been confined, again wanting to figure out how to get some of that natural character condition kind of back and move away from engineering-based responses to flood management to giving the river what's referred to as giving the river room to move or room for the river.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Wright has already actually asked my question.
Great.
Do you have any questions? Well, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Kay, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Anderson, thanks for joining us from your living room. Good to see your library is in good order and nice and tidy for us to look at.
Well, I made a special effort with that.
And thank you for your advice. Appreciate you coming along today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay. We're going to have a little break. She should be back at 3:45. We're going to come back at 3:45, and we've got the oil companies. Are they already? Great.
Are they here?
Okay. No, I only had a first name, Phil. So I didn't have a surname, sorry. Oh, that's right, it's Brown. Phil Brown? Yeah. Okay, nice to meet you. Brown. Yeah, welcome, come forward.
Oh, he's the guy, is he?
Sorry, I had Mr. Lawrenson was original. Oh. Brown. Yes. Okay. So I was just reminiscing that dewatering, it seems like it's a deja vu.
Yeah, I think,
Number of district plan hearings.
yeah, I think my colleague has been involved in it with you potentially.
Yes, yes, yeah. And some of the photos look familiar.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've read your statement. We've got the oral presentation here with us. So we're happy we're in your hands. So you're our last presentation. Now that isn't permission to take us through to 5 o'clock. But happy to hear from you now, and I'm sure we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So, just as a brief introduction, my name is Philip Brown. I'm a planning and policy consultant for Foresight. I've prepared evidence in chief, which I understand is to be taken as read, but I'd be pleased to answer any questions in relation to it. So firstly, I'd just like to draw the panel's attention to an error in paragraph 6.5 of my evidence. So in the track changes, I sought to change rule tank 22B part 4. The word then should have been replaced with the word through. So I'll revisit the drafting of that rule in paragraph 20 below. So following the receipt of submitted evidence...
Sorry, can you just give me that number again?
Yeah, sure. So that's paragraph 20 in this presentation, and then what I'm referring to is paragraph 6.5 in my evidence in chief.
6.5.
6.5, yeah. So
B was it?
yeah, so you'll see below that paragraph in my evidence, there's the drafting, my proposed amendment to that rule, and so there was just a slight wording. So instead of the word then, that should have been replaced with the word through.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
So that's B, Roman numeral 4.
that's right, yeah. So, following the receipt of the submitted evidence, Hawke's Bay Regional Council produced a Section 42A addendum hearing report on the proposed Plan Change 9. So the position of the reporting planner in this Section 42A addendum actually resolved a number of the matters that were raised in my evidence. And so that's allowed me to focus today on the remaining matters where I consider further amendments are required. So my presentation today addresses two key areas. That's temporary construction dewatering, and then secondly, stormwater discharges. So I've attached in Annexure 1 of my presentation the specific relief that I seek to the relevant provisions. And just for the avoidance of doubt, any reference that I make in this presentation is to the provisions of proposed Plan Change 9 as it's now set out in Appendix 2 to the Section 42A addendum, so that's the latest version. So I've provided 10 hard copies of this presentation and an electronic version to assist the panel. I understand everyone has that. So I'd firstly like to just provide some further context to the oil company's dewatering activities as described in the oil company's submission and in my evidence. So underground petroleum storage systems are key infrastructure at the oil company's sites. The replacement of these underground tanks at existing sites is an important maintenance activity that is typically undertaken if a tank is approaching the end of its life cycle, or if it's suspected to be leaking, or if a site is generally being upgraded. The dewatering of tank pits may be required to enable the safe and appropriate installation of tanks in accordance with HASNO Code of Practice 44, which is the relevant code of practice for the design and installation of these below-ground petroleum tanks. So in particular, the dewatering enables the contractors to safely access the base of the tank pit to anchor tanks to beams, to prevent the beams from actually floating out of position. So the typical tank and forecourt layouts are illustrated, and I'll get to that in a second, in figures 1 and 2, and a photo of an aging underground tank is shown in figure 3, while a photograph of a tank pit being prepared for installation is included at figure 4. So here's figure 1, which is an example of a short section of underground tanks, and so typically these are installed at depths of about 4.5 to 5.5 meters below the ground. And so you'll see there are these anchored structures at the bottom. And so these need to be secured to the base of the tank, and that's what actually often requires the interception of groundwater. So you'll see it there. So I'll move on to the next slide. So this is just a typical sort of layout of a service station where you have your vehicle refueling areas to the right, and then to the left, these tanks would obviously be underground, and then you have your remote truck refueling location up on the left, so the trucks will fill the tanks from there. So here you have, this is a photo of an aging tank, which is obviously rusted and needs to be replaced. And so tanks typically have a life cycle of 20 to 25 years. And so obviously it's quite important to enable and encourage the replacement of aging infrastructure like this. And then finally, so this is what a typical dewatering operation will look like. And so you have there, around the perimeter of the pit, you have sheet piles. And so those are the vertical sheets around the pit. And so those are really important because they prevent the lateral movement of water into the pit. And so that's what stops groundwater from travelling in. And so that's a key mechanism to limit the amount of groundwater taken. So these piles will go down about 6 meters in depth, and so the actual excavation will be, the maximum usually is about 5.5 meters, and so there's that extra bit below to ensure that groundwater is not going to be travelling in to the pit.
Is that sheet metaling required by the Code of Practice?
So that's the sheet metaling. I'm not sure if that's actually required by the Code of Practice, but this is set out in all of these companies have their own sort of procedures, and part of that is to install these sheet piles. It's a very typical undertaking.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just sort of moving on, and I've got another photo, but I'll come to that later. So while this temporary construction dewatering takes, they may, in a technical sense, be considered a form of abstraction. They're actually the result of the interception of groundwater during earthworks rather than any desire to actually take water. And further, where there's the need to take water, significant measures are taken to, as I was saying, to minimise the lateral movement of water, for instance, sheet piling. So dewatering abstractions are for tanks are also shallow, short-term. For contingency, they allow for 10 days, but that's just due to unforeseen weather circumstances. It might be up to 10 days, but the vast majority of times it will be 3 to 10 days. And so they're short-term events. While the dewatering so beyond the actual dewatering activities, then there's the treatment of dewatering water, and that's a fundamental part of these dewatering operations. But the proposed Plan Change 9 doesn't address these types of discharges, so I won't go into that here. So now I'll just talk about the latest version of the rules and just have a bit of a discussion and respond to the drafting of those. So Rule Tank 11, the Section 42A addendum, it responds to the issues raised in my evidence regarding the pathway for these temporary construction dewatering tanks. So in particular, it removes the potential prohibited pathway for these infrequent, temporary and short-term construction dewatering activities, which have a very limited potential of effects. As now proposed in the Section 42A addendum, Rule Tank 11 provides a discretionary pathway for temporary construction dewatering tanks that are not permitted by Rule Tank 8. So I support the removal of this potential cascade to prohibited activity status. I do consider that a minor amendment to B Roman numerals 2 is necessary to make clear that the exemption for these dewatering tanks is in relation to the allocation limits, and ensure that this clause itself applies to, and it clearly provides a discretionary pathway for frost protection, non-consumptive and temporary construction dewatering tanks. So this could be achieved by amending the provision as follows. So I've just shown in grey there how I'd reword it, just to show that it clearly applies in relation to the limits, not the actual clause itself. So moving to Tank Policy 53. As proposed in the Section 42 addendum, this policy now provides support for temporary and non-consumptive takes in addition to frost protection. As set out in paragraph 4.8 of my evidence, temporary construction dewatering activities may not necessarily be interpreted as being non-consumptive as defined, because dewatering of water, it's often taken off-site or discharged to the reticulated networks. Therefore, the introduction in the Section 42 addendum of reference to temporary takes in Policy 53 is relevant for temporary construction dewatering takes. So on that note, I do support the principle of this change, but I consider that the reference to temporary without further qualification, rather than specifically temporary construction dewatering, may go further than the reporting planner intended. And it might provide policy support for a range of what could be considered to be temporary takes with potentially unintended consequences. If providing more broadly for temporary takes was intended, the rationale for the reporting planner's position is not too clear. My concerns in this regard would be resolved by referring in Policy 53 to temporary construction dewatering rather than simply temporary takes more broadly. So this amendment would ensure that there's a robust policy framework in place to support the discretionary pathway for these activities. So I'll move to Policy 45 now. So Policy 53, which I've just spoken about, that requires metering, monitoring, and reporting for frost protection and other activities if necessary. So I support this proposed wording of Clause F, as it recognises that metering is not practicable in all situations. However, I don't think that what is practical in terms of metering and telemetry is reflected in Policy 45. So this policy doesn't recognise that metering and telemetry is not reasonable for temporary construction dewatering takes, which are they're pretty narrow, short-term in terms of hours and days, and insignificant in terms of the potential effects on water management. And in my experience, councils typically recognise this and are fairly pragmatic in how they condition consents that involve dewatering activities. So for instance, they'll accept that these takes can be estimated via pumping rates rather than using actual meters. So I'd consider that this should be supported by an amendment to Policy 45 as follows. And so I've shown the provision in here, and I've proposed to add on a qualification that says, or for temporary construction dewatering takes where measurements can be appropriately estimated by pumping rates to indicate that there should be an exemption provided in relation to these activities. So now I'll move on to stormwater discharges. So again, I'd just like to provide some further context as to how the oil companies typically manage stormwater runoff at their service station sites before I address some of the Section 42A addendum recommendations in relation to the same. So the Ministry for Environment, the environmental guidelines for water discharges from petroleum industry sites in New Zealand, these are also known as the MFE guidelines. They set out the best management practices for petroleum industry sites. For these sites, the key contaminant of concern is hydrocarbons. And the MFE guidelines state that the discharge waters shall contain less than 15 milligrams per litre of total petroleum hydrocarbons, or TPH, and 100 milligrams per litre of total suspended solids, that's TSS, averaged over the design storm event. The MFA guidelines also require that stormwater from what's called at-risk areas, and these are areas where essentially the hazardous substances are stored or used, these areas should be directed to oil water separators prior to discharge, and this will ensure that the maximum credible spill event is catered for and it achieves appropriate discharge quality once it releases from the site. The MFE guidelines provide for the balance areas to be discharged without passing through a separator. So I've...
Well, that diagram's pretty small.
Yeah, it's a little bit sort of distorted there.
It's a bit like a transistor radio at the moment.
Yeah. So what you can hopefully make out is, so this is basically the typical layout of a service station. So you have on the right, the orange would be the customer centre, and then you have to the left of that the forecourt area, and so this is where obviously the refuelling of vehicles occurs, and that's in the area shaded light blue. And then upwards of this you have the remote truck refilling station. So the key areas in which hazardous substances are stored are those shown shaded light blue. So those are essentially, they form their own catchments. So the design of the service station through the raised mounds and the contouring of these sites, it ensures that certain areas go through to the separators on site, and the other areas which are not at risk, essentially, they don't go to the separators. And so that's just to provide some context before I go into this next part. So I'll start at Rule Tank 21. So the previous drafting of this rule, which was intended to provide a potential controlled activity pathway for network discharges, it precluded discharges that contain hazardous substances, but it also precluded discharges that are from a site used for the storage, use, or transfer of hazardous substances. My evidence set out that this rule should be deleted because the exclusion of hazardous substances, even at trace levels, would effectively preclude any network discharge from actually using the controlled activity pathway. And so I consider that its retention it just unnecessarily complicated the rule cascade. The Section 42A addendum, it recommended deletion of the part that said, or from a site used for the storage, use, or transfer of hazardous substances in response to evidence from Carmen Taylor on behalf of Ravensdown Limited, who considered that these discharges should be given the opportunity to achieve compliance with this rule, but the preclusion for discharges that contain hazardous substances, that was retained in the rule. The Section 42A addendum considered that this amendment would resolve the issue with the previous drafting, whereby it would have been impossible for local authority network consents to meet, given that they, by default, drain industrial zoned land where these sites are commonplace. However, in my view, this deletion would not have the intended outcome that the reporting planner seeks, because I think the fact remains that most discharges, they'll have detectable levels of hazardous substances in some form. For example, stormwater runoff from roads often contains traces of copper from brakes or zinc from car tyres. And as a result, these discharges would remain non-compliant with this effectively zero tolerance threshold. And this would result in network consents always cascading to discretionary activity under Rule 23. In the event that they were granted consent under controlled activity consent under Rule 21, I would have expected conditions of the consent to effectively preclude or exclude discharges of hazardous substances, which I don't really consider to be realistic, given that most, if not all, discharges will contain trace levels of hazardous substances. So if Rule Tank 21 is to be retained, I consider that the preclusion for discharges that contain hazardous substances, it should be removed, and the reliance should be placed on the balance of standards which appropriately address water quality. So moving now to Rule Tank 10. For the same reason as I set out in relation to that Rule Tank 21, I also consider that the preclusion for discharges that contain hazardous substances in Clause A, Roman numerals 4 of Rule 19 should also be deleted, basically for the same reasons.
Sorry, your heading says Rule Tank 10 and your text says Rule Tank 19. Under that, paragraph 19.
Oh, I apologise, that's potentially an error. I think that should say Rule Tank 19. They say Rule Tank 19, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's Rule Tank 19. Okay, so moving to Rule Tank 22. My evidence, it set out that it's necessary to provide a clear discretionary consenting pathway for MFE compliant stormwater discharges from petroleum industry sites where stormwater is passed through an interceptor prior to discharge. The Section 42A addendum supported my view, and it amended that rule accordingly. While I agree with the pathway put forward, I consider that an amendment to Rule Tank 22B Part 4 would be clearer if it specified that the oil interceptor is installed to serve areas where hazardous substances are actually stored and handled, which are essentially the at-risk areas which I identified previously. For further clarity, the standard could also require that the interceptor achieves compliance with the MFE guidelines in relation to TPH levels, total petroleum hydrocarbons. So to this effect, I recommend that this clause is redrafted as follows. And so I've shown here in grey how I would propose to redraft it. And basically I would add in an exemption for petroleum hydrocarbons where the water is passed through an interceptor and the discharge does not contain more than 15 milligrams per litre of total petroleum hydrocarbons prior to release.
So you've said the word, you've cut out the word oil before interceptor. Is that intended?
No, it's the word, or it's not a deliberate omission there. So the word oil can be in there.
So through an oil interceptor?
Yes, yeah. So to demonstrate how some other plans similarly manage stormwater discharges from sites storing or handling hazardous substances, I've included in Annexure 2 some specific rules from the Southland, Northland and Wellington regional plans, and in there you'll see how these plans have dealt with provisions in a similar way but with slightly different wording. So it's just for the benefit of the panel. So for completeness, I note that I support the deletion of Clause E in Rule 22, which previously stated that the rule is only applicable where there is no network connection available. I also support the latest amendment to Policy 28 to include reference to relevant industry guidelines as sought in my evidence in chief. And finally, I'll be pleased to answer any questions in relation to this oral statement or address any questions the panel have from my evidence in chief.
Oh, just one question around the MFE guidelines for petroleum industry sites. It's a 1998 publication, which is getting on a bit now. Do you know if there's any plans to revise that document?
I'm not specifically aware of if there's any plan to revise it. However, my understanding is that it talks about these standards which have been in place for years, and that, you know, through rigorous testing and methods, and that includes, especially in relation to the TPH and TSS limits, and they've been around for years, but I think that's just because they're so reliable in terms of there are all sorts of methods in order to see. For example, when it comes to TPH levels, the limit is it's 15 milligrams per litre, and a very sort of reliable method that's been used over the years, in addition to all of the rigorous procedures that go on these sites, is visual monitoring. And because what happens with TPH or hydrocarbons, obviously they rise to the surface, and a sheen establishes at the surface of water at levels far below 15 milligrams per litre, and so there's all these methods in place that have been dictated by the MFE guidelines that have proven very reliable over the years. But in response to your question, I'm not specifically aware of.
I suppose those concentration limits, they're based on, is it best practice for the treatment technology or the oil interceptor technology at the time, rather than receiving environment, or and also whether, given it is 20-something years old, whether the technology has moved on since then, and therefore the those concentration limits are now even more achievable or than at the time.
Yeah, well, I think that could be correct. I'm not sure if the technology has, moved on. It could be the case. But I know that for instance, with interceptors, they've done rigorous testing to ensure that they've been designed to contain the maximum credible spill event, which is basically if you have 2,500 litres of oil and you put it down the drain and goes into the interceptor, the MFE guidelines require that they're designed to be managed so that once they go through the interceptor and into the environment, they're below those thresholds. And so there have been rigorous tests to demonstrate that's the case. And potentially, as you say, the quality of these interceptors have improved since this was drafted. I'm not sure if that's the case, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and is it your evidence in chief or somebody else's, Mark Lawrenson's?
Yeah, so Mark Lawrenson is my colleague. He prepared a submission for the oil companies back, I'm not sure,
yeah, well, that's,
a while
that's
ago.
The one that I'm reading. It's got his name on it. So.
Oh, yeah. So the evidence.
Ask the question out of that evidence is.
Yeah, so the evidence was prepared by me. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. You say there that bulk storage and marine facilities are outside the catchment, so don't count, I'm assuming, from that?
Yeah, so you're talking about bulk terminal
Well, I
storage
don't know.
sites?
Well, I've just used the word bulk storage, bulk terminals. So there are none nearby?
My understanding is that there aren't any in this in the tank catchment. So in relation to the oil company's assets, it's more concerned with service stations and truck refueling facilities.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So that partly answers my question, because I was going to ask a question around, even if they aren't within the catchment, and they might just be down the road, for example, isn't there a potential still, though, for some sort of, for people to be concerned about them, I guess?
Or you're saying in relation to bulk fuel storage?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't think there are. Obviously, the scope of this is confined to what's in the catchment, but I don't think there are any sort of even just outside the catchment.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, you've answered my question.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And, then you, I know you haven't addressed it today, but in your early evidence, you did make some reference to contaminated soils, and I wondered whether or not disturbance of contaminated soils, that your concern was to make sure that these were covered by Plan Change 9.
Yeah, could you direct me to?
Oh, I don't know. I've just made a note of it.
Okay.
But is it a concern?
In relation to contaminate, like the
Yeah.
disturbance of contaminated soils,
Yeah.
I would think that's potentially outside the scope of this plan change, which relates to water quality. But if there's a specific area where it's mentioned, I could.
Well, let's. I'll pass you over and see if I can find it.
Yep. Okay.
I think Mr. Kirikiri's got the last of the questions for us.
There, in paragraph 3 in the introduction, you list a number of things there that you hope covered by Plan Change 9, and one of them is disturbance of contaminated soils.
That's
Dot number 3. Bullet point number 3.
of the evidence in chief.
Yeah.
Or,
Or might look at something different. That's why I asked the question.
Oh, yeah,
It's under Mark Lawrenson's name.
so potentially that's, could that be the submission you're looking at? The evidence, which I have here, that's my evidence. I don't have a paragraph 3.0 or 3.
Well, it's the submission we were given, and it's submission number 203.
Oh, okay.
Foresight? Yeah. And that's what I was
And
reading initially when I went through what I thought would be your presentation today, and that was one of the things
Oh, okay.
I focused on.
No, I don't have any concerns in relation to that matter. So nothing that needs to be addressed here from my perspective. Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Appreciate that.
Right. Thank you.
That concludes our submissions for the day. Tomorrow morning we're starting at 9 o'clock. We've got Ngāti Kahunganu Iwi, and a full day of submitters right through to the end of tomorrow. Was there anything we needed to be aware of? Any questions? No? Okay. Hoi anō, he mihi kawana kia koutou, kia pai tō haere. I think it stopped raining, so hopefully you get a dry trip home. We'll see you in the morning, 9 o'clock. Thank you. Oh, what's the security like in here?